She gave away her only meal to a stranger, and that single, hungry moment of kindness accidentally handed her the life she never dared to want. A quiet cook, a cornbread she never meant to share, and one rancher who stopped long enough to actually look at her, when the whole town had spent years looking straight through her. This is the story of Eliza Hart, the woman nobody noticed, until the night one man did. If this story moves you, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this little tale has traveled. Hit that like button and stay with me until the very end. You won't want to miss where this goes.
First, The
The boarding house on Callan Street was the kind of place that smelled like old grease and other people's bad luck. It sat at the far end of town, wedged between a saddle shop that had been closed for 2 years and a livery stable that never quite managed to clean itself up. The sign above the door, Hattie's Boarding House and Meals, had weathered so badly that the letters were more suggestion than fact. 3 of the nail heads holding it to the wall had rusted clean through, so the sign hung at a permanent tilt, like a man who'd had 1 drink too many and was still trying to look respectable. Inside on a Tuesday evening in late October, the main room was full. Ranch hands occupied most of the long table nearest the window. 2 traveling merchants had claimed the corner booth with the kind of territorial seriousness usually reserved for property disputes. A handful of local men, miners, a blacksmith, the postmaster, filled in the gaps between, their voices layering over each other in that comfortable, thoughtless way that men in a group tend to talk, which is to say loudly and mostly about themselves. Nobody was paying attention to the kitchen. That was not unusual. Nobody ever paid attention to the kitchen, which suited the woman in it just fine. Eliza Hart was 23 years old and had the particular skill, developed over a lifetime of necessity, of being completely invisible in a room. She moved between the stove and the serving table with the economy of someone who had learned long ago not to take up space she hadn't been invited to occupy. Her dark hair was pulled back practical and plain. Her dress was clean, but the fabric had seen better years. Her hands, when they moved over the pots and the iron pan, were quick and sure in the way that hands get when they've done the same work thousands of times. She was not what anyone would call striking. She was not trying to be. The cornbread had been an accident, in the way that many of the best things start out as accidents. She'd had a heel of corn flour left over, not quite enough to make a proper pan for the house, but too much to let sit and go stale. She'd added a scrape of lard, a pinch of salt, a little of the buttermilk that Hattie kept in the cold cellar, and she'd baked it in a small cast-iron skillet at the back corner of the oven, where the heat ran just a degree or 2 lower than the center. That was her supper. She set it on the windowsill to cool while she finished serving the men in the main room, carrying out plates of salt pork and boiled potatoes and a pot of beans that had been going since morning. The work was steady. The room was loud. She moved through it without speaking unless spoken to, and she was rarely spoken to beyond more coffee. And where's my bread? She didn't mind. Or rather, she had stopped allowing herself to feel one way or the other about it, which was not the same thing, but it was the version of not minding that she had access to. She was on her second trip back from the kitchen when she noticed the man near the door. He had come in sometime in the last 10 minutes without her registering it, which was unusual. Eliza had developed, over years of working in small rooms with unpredictable people, an almost instinctive awareness of who was where and what kind of mood they were carrying. She noticed people. She just didn't let on that she did. This one was hard to miss once you saw him, though easy to mistake for just another ranch hand at first glance. He was somewhere in his middle 20s, broad through the shoulders in the way that came from actual work rather than show, with the kind of permanent tan on his forearms and the back of his neck that marked him as a man who spent his days outside. His hat was good quality, but it had been worn hard. His boots were the same story. He sat at the end of the long table with his back to the wall, the seat a careful man always takes in an unfamiliar room, and he was watching the room with a kind of quiet attention that Eliza recognized because she practiced something very similar herself. Cole Mercer. She knew him by sight, the way you know people in a small town without ever having actually met them. He ran the Mercer Ranch out past the Eastern Ridge, had taken it over from his father 2 years prior after the old man's health gave out. People spoke well of him in the way they speak well of men who pay their debts on time and don't cause unnecessary trouble. She set a plate in front of him without comment. He thanked her without looking up from his hat, which he was turning slowly in his hands, apparently thinking about something. Eliza went back to the kitchen. It was nearly 8 o'clock when the last of the men began drifting out, and she was scraping the iron pot when she realized she'd forgotten about the cornbread. She set down the scraper and crossed to the windowsill. The skillet was still there. The bread inside it had cooled to the perfect temperature, that just past warm stage where the crust had set into something with a little crackle to it and the inside had finished settling. She picked up a clean cloth, ready to sit down for the first time in 6 hours and eat something. She heard the coughing from the hallway. It was a child's cough, thin and wet, the kind that comes from having gone too long without eating properly, not from sickness. Eliza knew the difference. She had made that cough herself once, when she was small. She set the skillet back on the windowsill and went to the hallway door. The girl standing there was maybe 7 years old, too thin, wearing a coat that had been made for someone bigger and belted with a piece of rope to keep it closed. She had big dark eyes and the hollow-cheeked look of a child who was used to going to bed hungry. She was not crying. She had the flat, practical expression of a child who had figured out early that crying didn't accomplish much. Eliza looked at her for a moment. "You hungry?" she said. The girl looked at the floor. "My ma said not to beg." "I'm not asking if you're begging," Eliza said. "I'm asking if you're hungry." A pause. Then a short nod. Eliza went back to the kitchen, picked up the skillet, wrapped the cornbread in the cloth, and handed it to the girl. The whole thing. All of it. "You take that home to your ma," she said. The girl clutched the cloth bundle to her chest with both hands and looked up at Eliza with an expression that was hard to look at directly. "Thank you, ma'am." "Go on," Eliza said, not unkindly. "It's getting cold." She stood in the kitchen doorway and watched the girl disappear down the hall and out through the back. Then she turned back to the empty kitchen, looked at the cold stove and the scraped pot, and felt the particular kind of hunger that has nothing to do with food settle somewhere behind her ribs. She had done it before. She would do it again. That was simply who she was. She didn't know that Cole Mercer had come back through the hallway to retrieve his forgotten gloves from the hook beside the back door. She didn't know he had seen the whole thing. She was rinsing the last of the plates when she heard boots behind her and turned to find him standing in the kitchen doorway. She nearly dropped the plate. "Didn't mean to startle you," he said quickly. He held up the gloves in explanation. "Forgot these." "Kitchen's not for guests," she said, which was not quite get out, but was in that neighborhood. "I know." He didn't move. He was looking past her toward the windowsill where the skillet still sat, empty. Then he looked back at her. "That cornbread," he said. "I saw it when you were cooling it earlier. Was that for the house, or—" "It's gone," she said. "I know. I saw where it went." She looked at him steadily, waiting for whatever came next. An observation. A comment. Pity, maybe, which was the thing she liked least of all the reactions people had to her. Cole Mercer turned his hat in his hands, the same gesture she'd noticed earlier, and said, "I didn't get a piece, but I could smell it from across the room. Where'd you learn to bake cornbread?" She blinked. That was not what she'd expected. "Myself," she said. "I figured it out." "How long you been cooking here?" 3 years. "You always give your supper away?" The question landed differently than she expected. Not accusatory, not pitying, just direct. Like he actually wanted to know the answer. "She was hungry," Eliza said. He nodded slowly, as though she had answered a question he had been thinking about for longer than this conversation. "I'm Cole Mercer," he said. "I've got a ranch out east." "I know who you are." A slight shift in his expression, not quite a smile, but close to one. "Fair enough. You're Eliza Hart. You've been cooking at Hattie's since you were 20. She looked at him differently now. "You asked about me." "I asked Hattie your name after I smelled that cornbread." He said it plainly, like it was a perfectly ordinary thing. "I was going to compliment the cook. Figured I should know who I was talking to." Eliza didn't know what to do with that information, so she set it aside for a moment. Hattie doesn't like people in her kitchen. "I'll be quick." He looked directly at her, and there was something in the look that was not what she was accustomed to from men in rooms like this one. Not wanting, not dismissing, just attention. Genuine, unperformed attention, directed at her specifically. "Miss Hart, I just watched you give away the only food you had left after a full day's work without a second's hesitation. I don't know if you realize what that looks like from the outside." It looks like foolishness, she said, because that was what Hattie would have said. It looks like character, he said quietly. That's a rarer thing than people want to admit. He put his hat on, touched the brim in what passed for a farewell, and walked out through the back door. Eliza stood in the kitchen and listened to his boots cross the back porch and disappear into the dark. She stood there for a full minute after the sound was gone. Then she went back to rinsing plates because there was nothing else to do, and because she had learned a long time ago not to attach herself to moments that weren't hers to keep. She had grown up in the Millhaven County orphanage, which was not a terrible place in the way that some places were terrible. No one had been deliberately cruel to her, no specific catastrophe had occurred, but it had the particular quality of all such institutions, which was that it processed children rather than raised them. You were fed, you were clothed, you were taught to read and do figures and sew a straight seam. You were not, in any meaningful sense, known. Eliza had arrived there at age 4, brought by a county official whose name she had never learned, and she had spent the next 14 years navigating the institution's rhythms with the quiet adaptability of a child who understood very early that the children who made themselves easy were the children who got left alone, and being left alone was the closest thing to peace that the place offered. She was not the prettiest girl there, which was something she absorbed early and did not waste energy grieving. She was not the most charming or the most clever or the quickest to cry, which brought its own protections. She was useful. She learned to cook at 11 because the woman who managed the orphanage kitchen was getting older and her joints were giving out, and she needed a pair of reliable hands. Eliza became those hands. She learned because she wanted to learn, and because the kitchen was the one place in the orphanage where there was a clear logic. You did a thing correctly, and it produced a result. The result was real. The result nourished people. That meant something. She left at 18 with $12 saved from odd work, a carpet bag with her possessions in it, and no one to see her off. She had walked 3 miles to the nearest town and asked at the first boarding house she found if they needed any help. They had. She had stayed for 2 years. Then she'd heard about Hattie's from a woman on a coach going west, and she had followed the rumor because Hattie supposedly paid better than most and didn't ask too many questions. Both things had turned out to be true. She was good at the work. She was maybe better than good. Hattie had told her once, in the way Hattie told anyone anything, which was gruffly and sideways, that her biscuits were the only reason half the town still came in for breakfast. Eliza had said thank you and meant it, and then gone back to work, which was how she received most things. The town knew her in the way that towns know their service people, by function rather than face. She was the cook at Hattie's. She was the woman who brought your coffee. She was the pair of hands that set your plate in front of you. She had lived in Callan for 3 years, and she could count on one hand the number of people who had asked her a question that was not related to the food. She was not bitter about this. She had considered bitterness and decided it was too expensive and too heavy to carry everywhere. But she would not have called herself happy either. She was surviving. She was useful. She had a small room at the back of the boarding house with a window that faced east, and in the mornings she could see the light come up over the ridge. And that was something. It was enough. She had told herself it was enough so many times that she almost believed it. Cole Mercer came back on Thursday. This was not, in itself, significant. Men came back to Hattie's regularly. The food was decent and the prices were fair, and it was one of only 3 places in town to get a hot meal. His presence at the end of the long table did not require an explanation, except that he came back on Saturday too, and the following Tuesday. Eliza noticed. She noticed because noticing was what she did. She told herself she was only noticing because he was the kind of man it was practical to keep track of. A ranch owner of some standing who ate quietly and tipped fair and didn't start anything. But she was not entirely honest with herself about this, and some part of her knew it. He always sat with his back to the wall. He always turned his hat in his hands when he was thinking about something. He did not talk much at the table, but when he did talk, the men around him listened, which told her something about who he was among his own people. He ate everything on his plate. He said thank you, and he said it like he meant it, not like it was just the sound a person makes at the end of receiving something. He did not try to talk to her in the kitchen again. She told herself she wasn't watching for it. The Harvest Festival came at the end of November, which was later than most towns held it, but Callan had always been slightly out of step with the rest of the county's rhythms. a fact its residents had long since decided to be proud of rather than embarrassed by. The festival took over the main street for 2 days. There was music, a fiddle player, and a man with a squeeze box who only knew 4 songs but played them with great conviction. And there was food, and there were games for the children, and there was dancing in the square on the second evening. The whole town came. Even people who didn't particularly like each other managed to occupy the same 20 yards of street for the duration, held together by the particular social glue of shared celebration. Hattie contributed a table of baked goods and savory pies, all of which had been made by Eliza. Hattie accepted the compliments on them personally, which was her habit, and Eliza was behind the table serving slices and refilling the coffee urn without complaint. By 7 in the evening, the dancing had started. The fiddle player had switched to something faster, and the crowd had rearranged itself into couples and clusters at the edge of the makeshift square. Eliza watched from behind the table with the particular wistfulness of someone who is technically at a party, but not quite in it. She didn't dance. She never had. She wouldn't have known who to dance with, and she wouldn't have felt right leaving the table anyway. She was cutting a new pie when she heard someone approach and looked up expecting a customer. Cole Mercer was standing on the other side of the table. He was dressed better than she'd seen him before. Cleaner coat, a shirt that was pressed, though his hat was the same one. He looked like a man who had made an effort, which, she had come to observe, was not something he always did. "Miss Hart," he said. "Mr. Mercer." She set down the knife. "What can I get you?" "Nothing from the table." He paused, and she saw in the pause what it cost him. He was not a naturally awkward man, but whatever he was about to say required something from him that didn't come easily. "I was wondering if you'd like to dance." Eliza looked at him. The table between them felt for a moment like the most significant object in the county. "I'm working," she said. "The pies will keep." "Hattie." "I already spoke to Hattie." He said it simply, like it was just information. "She said to tell you to go ahead." Eliza stared at him. Then she looked over at Hattie, who was at the far end of the table talking to the minister's wife, and who, without looking up or changing her expression at all, made the smallest possible shooing motion with one hand. Eliza looked back at Cole Mercer. Her chest was doing something complicated that she didn't have a name for, which was a problem because she preferred to have names for things. "I should tell you," she said carefully, "I'm not very good at dancing." "Neither am I," he said. "I figured if we were both bad at it, we'd be on equal footing." She almost smiled. She caught it just before it happened, but it was close. She came around the table. He had been right about being bad at it. He stepped on her foot twice in the first 30 seconds and apologized both times with a directness that she found more charming than she expected to. She missed the rhythm twice herself and had to stop and find it again. They were, as he had predicted, equally terrible, which had the useful effect of making the whole thing feel less like a performance and more like 2 people simply trying to get through something together. The music was loud. The square was crowded. Nobody was paying particular attention to them. Or rather, people noticed. She could feel it, the subtle shift in the ambient attention of the crowd, the way eyes drifted toward them and then away and then back again. She could imagine what they were seeing, the rancher from the East Ridge, dancing with Hattie's cook. The woman nobody particularly thought about. It wasn't scandal. It was curiosity, which was almost worse, because curiosity required no sympathy. She kept her eyes level and did not let herself worry about it. "You've been coming into Hattie's more than usual," she said, because silence during dancing felt strange to her. "I have," he agreed. "The food is the same as it always was." "I know." She looked at him directly. He looked back, and she thought again about that quality she'd noticed in him from the beginning, the paying attention, the actual looking. "Why?" she said. She bowed. He thought about it for a moment, and she liked that he thought about it rather than answering too fast. "Because I wanted to," he said. "I know that's not a very complete answer." "It's an honest one," she said. "I'm better at honest than complete," he said. "Fair warning." She didn't say anything for a moment. The music shifted into something slower. Several of the older couples drifted off the square, and a few of the younger ones moved closer together. "I'm going to ask you something," Cole said, "and I want you to actually consider it before you say no." Something in her stomach tightened. "All right. I need someone to run the kitchen at the ranch. Properly run it. Not just cook, but manage it. manage the supplies and the hands meals and the household side of things. My last cook left in August, and I haven't found anyone worth asking. He paused. I'm asking you. Eliza processed this. You're offering me a job, she said. Yes. At your ranch? Yes. She looked at him carefully, looking for the thing underneath the thing. She was good at finding it. She'd had to be. Why me? There are better cooks in this county who aren't… She stopped herself. Who aren't what? She thought. Alone? Expendable? Who have more experience with that kind of operation? She finished. Maybe, he said, but I haven't seen any of them give away their supper to a hungry child and not mention it to anyone. That stopped her. I need someone whose judgment I can trust, he said. The cooking is one thing, but a ranch is a household. It's people. It requires someone who actually… He seemed to look for the word, gives a damn about the work and about the people the work is for. The fiddle player had started on his second song, which was nearly identical to his first but in a different key. Eliza thought about her small room with the east-facing window. She thought about 3 years of carrying plates to men who didn't look at her. She thought about the particular tiredness of being useful in a place where usefulness was the only currency you had, and about how at 23 she could already see the next 20 years of her life laid out in front of her like a road that didn't go anywhere new. She thought about this girl with the rope belt and the hollow cheeks, and the feeling of giving the cornbread away, which had been the right thing, which had also been the only thing she had. It would be a trial, Cole said. 6 weeks. If it doesn't work for either of us, no hard feelings, and I'll pay your way back to town. You'd put that in writing? She said. He blinked, then nodded slowly. I'll put it in writing. She looked at him for another moment. I'll need to give Hattie 2 weeks' notice, she said. He exhaled, just slightly, just enough for her to see that this had mattered to him more than he was letting on. 2 weeks is fine, and I'll need a room of my own. You'll have one. And I make my own kitchen decisions. I'll take input on what the men want, but I run the ordering and the schedule. That's the job, he agreed. She looked out at the square, at the dancing couples and the lit lanterns, and the town doing what towns did on celebration nights, all of it carrying on around the two of them like water around stones. All right, Mr. Mercer, she said. 6 weeks. He nodded, and he didn't smile, or not exactly, but something in his face settled, like a knot carefully untied. They finished the dance. She went back to the pie table. He left an hour later, touching the brim of his hat as he passed. Hattie said nothing when Eliza came back to the table, which, for Hattie, was practically a ringing endorsement. The 2 weeks passed in the way that periods of waiting tend to pass, alternately, too slowly and too quickly, leaving her with too much time to think and not enough time to be sure of anything. She thought about backing out 4 times. The first time was the morning after the festival, when she woke up in her east-facing room and looked at the familiar angle of the morning light on the wall and thought about how much she did not want to be in an unfamiliar place trying to find her footing again. The second time was when she told Hattie officially, and Hattie made a sound that was not quite approval but contained something underneath it that Eliza could not read. The third time was when she was packing her carpet bag and realized that everything she owned fit into it comfortably with room to spare, which was not a comforting thought. The fourth time was the night before she left, when she sat on the edge of her bed and calculated, for the first time, what she was actually risking. She had a job. She had a room. She had a position in this town that was small and invisible and paid barely enough but was hers. She had built it herself over 3 years. She was about to hand all of it to 6 weeks of unknown. She sat there for a while in the dark. Then she thought about the girl with the rope belt and the expression on her face when she took the cornbread. And she thought about Cole Mercer standing in the kitchen doorway, saying that looks like character, and the way it had landed in her chest like something she hadn't known she was waiting to hear. She thought about what she'd said when she accepted the trial. She thought about being 23 years old and choosing the same road because it was familiar and because she was afraid. She lay down and stared at the ceiling until she fell asleep. In the morning, she picked up the carpet bag and walked out to where Cole Mercer's wagon was waiting at the end of Callan Street, the horses stamping in the cold, breath rising in clouds in the early air. He was already up on the seat. He saw her coming and climbed down and took her bag without asking, tossed it into the back of the wagon with an ease that was both practical and somehow kind. "Breakfast," he said, handing her up. Mrs. Delaney at the ranch always has coffee going by the time we get back. Who's Mrs. Delaney? My neighbor's wife. She's been coming in 3 mornings a week since August to keep the household from dissolving. He climbed up beside her and took the reins. She'll be relieved to hand things off. Eliza held her bag on her lap for a moment, then set it behind the seat. The wagon pulled out onto the road east. The morning was cold and clear, the kind of November sky that goes so hard and blue it almost doesn't look real. Neither of them said much for the first mile. The horses found their rhythm. The town fell behind them. After a while, Eliza said, "The cornbread, that night." "Yes?" "I hadn't eaten yet," she said. "That was my supper." Cole was quiet for a moment. She watched his jaw tighten slightly, then release. "I know," he said. She looked at him. "I figured," he said quietly. "Hattie ran a lean kitchen, and you didn't take anything else after." He kept his eyes on the road. "That's why I came back Thursday and Saturday. I wanted to—" He stopped. "I don't know. I wanted to make sure you were all right." Eliza looked forward at the road and the ridge and the pale sky above it. She did not say anything for a long moment. "I was all right," she said finally. "I know that too," he said. "Now." The wagon rolled east through the cold morning air, and the ranch, and whatever came after, waited somewhere ahead of them beyond the ridge. Eliza Hart held herself straight on the seat. She was terrified, but for the first time in a very long time, she was also, underneath the terror, something that felt almost like awake. The Mercer Ranch sat on 460 acres of land that had been worked by the same family for 2 generations, and when Eliza first saw it coming around the eastern bend of the road, her first honest thought was that it was bigger than she'd imagined and harder looking than she'd expected. The house itself was solid, 2 stories, built from good lumber, with a covered porch that ran across the full front and windows that were real glass rather than oilskin, which in this part of the country still meant something. But it carried the particular look of a place that had been managed by a man without enough help for too long. A hinge on the front gate that sat wrong, stovepipe that needed blacking, firewood that was stacked efficiently but not neatly, small signs of competence without comfort. It was a working ranch. She could see that plainly. It was not a home, not yet, not in the way she understood a home. It was a machine for running cattle. She stepped down from the wagon and looked at it and thought, "This is what I'm being asked to change." She felt the weight of that, and for a moment it pressed down on her harder than she expected. Then the front door opened and a broad, weathered woman with white hair and flour on her apron stepped out onto the porch, looked at Eliza, and said, "Lord in heaven, you're younger than I expected. Can you actually cook?" "Yes, ma'am," Eliza said. "You'd better," said Mrs. Delaney. "These men eat like horses and complain like politicians." She looked at Cole over Eliza's head. "You told her about the bread situation?" "What bread situation?" Eliza said. Cole looked like a man who had been hoping this would come up later. "The hands have opinions about biscuits," he said. "They have demands," Mrs. Delaney said. "Get her inside and introduce her. I have a pie in Callan's oven, and my husband will eat it himself if I don't get back." She pointed a flour-dusted finger at Eliza. "You're going to be fine. Just don't back down and don't oversalt the beans. They'll test you. Don't let them." She was down the porch steps and walking toward her wagon before Eliza had fully processed the speech. Eliza looked at Cole. "The bread situation," she said. He picked up her bag. "Come on inside," he said. "I'll explain about the biscuits." She followed him up the porch steps and through the front door. She had 6 weeks. She intended to make them count. The biscuit situation, as it turned out, was exactly as complicated as Mrs. Delaney's expression had suggested. There were 7 ranch hands on the Mercer payroll, and within the first 20 minutes of Eliza's arrival in the kitchen, she had learned 3 things about them. They ate in shifts because the table only seated 5 comfortably. They had strong and contradictory opinions about what constituted a proper biscuit, and they were going to test her. Mrs. Delaney had been right about that, too. The kitchen itself was large, larger than Hattie's, which surprised her, with a good iron range that ran along the east wall and a work table down the center that had been scrubbed so many times the wood had gone pale. The larder was reasonably stocked. The organization, however, was the kind that happened when no one person had been in charge long enough to impose a system, which meant everything was technically present and nothing was where it should be. She spent the first afternoon taking inventory, not cooking, not meeting anyone beyond a brief mutual assessment nod when Cole brought the hands through to introduce them. Just standing in the kitchen, going through every shelf and drawer and hook, making notes in the small ledger she'd brought in her carpet bag, understanding the shape of what she'd agreed to. The hands were a mixed group. Two brothers named Pete and Del Hauser, who were nearly identical in appearance but opposite in temperament. Pete talked constantly. Del barely spoke. A quiet Mexican man named Rodrigo, who handled the horses and had hands so careful they looked like they belonged to a watchmaker. A red-haired young hand called Jimmy, who couldn't have been more than 19 and looked at Eliza with the polite wariness of someone who had been warned to behave. Two older men, Walt and Cass, who had been on the Mercer land since Cole's father's time, and who regarded the arrival of any new person with the same patient skepticism they probably applied to weather and market prices. And then there was Harlan. Harlan was the foreman, which meant he was second to Cole on the ranch and first in the opinion of himself. He was 40-something, thick through the middle, with a permanent squint and the manner of a man who had been in charge of smaller things long enough to mistake it for authority over larger ones. He came into the kitchen on her first evening while she was setting out supper and stood in the doorway with his thumbs in his belt. "Hattie's cook," he said, by way of introduction. "Eliza Hart," she said, not looking up from the pot. "You want something?" "Just looking." "Kitchen's not for looking," she said, which was, she realized a half-second later, almost word for word what she'd said to Cole that first night. Apparently it was becoming her standard response to uninvited men in doorways. Harlan made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a dismissal. "Previous cook let us come in and get coffee whenever we wanted." "Previous cook isn't here," Eliza said. She set the ladle down and turned to face him fully, because she had understood from Mrs. Delaney's warning that the first few days were going to determine the next 6 weeks, and she was not going to lose ground on day one. "You want coffee, you ask. You want to know what's for supper, you ask. But you don't come into my kitchen and stand there like you're deciding something, because there's nothing in here for you to decide. Understood?" Harlan looked at her for a long moment. She looked back. "Yes, ma'am," he said finally, in a tone that meant we'll see about that rather than actual agreement, and left. She turned back to the pot. Her hands were steady. Her heart was going somewhat faster than usual, but no one could see that. Supper that night was salt pork with gravy, roasted potatoes, stewed tomatoes from the cellar, and biscuits. The biscuits were not, she knew, going to resolve the biscuit debate. Nothing baked on a first night in an unfamiliar oven was going to settle anything. But they were good. They were hers. She knew that much. The men ate without much comment, which in her experience was better than the alternative. Pete Hauser said the gravy was better than what they'd been having, which she took as the compliment it probably was. Del Hauser said nothing and had a second helping, which was a better compliment than words. Jimmy ate so fast she worried briefly about his digestion. Cole ate at the end of the table, and she was bringing out the coffee when he looked up and caught her eye. "Good," he said simply. That was all. One word. But he said it the way he said most things, like he meant it, like it had been considered before it came out, and she carried it back into the kitchen and set it somewhere quiet inside herself for later. She was going to need it, because the biscuit debate was about to get considerably more complicated. It emerged over the following 3 days, in pieces, that the 7 men on the Mercer Ranch held 7 distinct positions on what a biscuit should be. Pete wanted them taller. Del apparently had once eaten a biscuit somewhere in Georgia that had changed his life, and now held all subsequent biscuits to a standard that no human being could reasonably maintain. Rodrigo was indifferent to biscuits entirely, but had strong feelings about corn tortillas, which no one else seemed to agree with him about. A cultural injustice Eliza quietly resolved on day 3 by learning from him, over a 15-minute conversation conducted partly in his limited English and partly in her non-existent Spanish, what he actually wanted, and then making it. His expression when she set the plate in front of him was the kind that people produce when they're surprised by something they didn't think to hope for. She filed it away. That was what the work actually was. She was beginning to understand, not just cooking, but learning what people needed and finding the version of it she could provide. Harlan continued to be a problem, though a manageable one. He came to the kitchen door twice more in that first week, each time with a slightly different angle of approach. Once with a request that she'd made a mistake in the supply order. She hadn't. once with a comment about how the previous cook had done things differently, delivered with the particular emphasis that meant better, though he didn't say it directly. Each time she responded in the same way, directly, without raising her voice, without backing down. She wasn't unkind about it, she just didn't move. On the fourth day, Cole found her in the kitchen after supper, standing at the work table with her ledger open, reworking the weekly supply list. "Harlan giving you trouble?" he said. She considered the question. "Nothing I can't manage." "I could talk to him." "Please don't," she said, and she meant it. "If you do that, I spend the next 6 weeks with a man who thinks he needs to be managed on my behalf. That's worse." Cole leaned against the door frame. He did this, she'd noticed, stood in doorways rather than sitting, as though he hadn't quite committed to being in the room yet. "Fair point," he said. "He's been on this ranch since before I took it over. He's got his ways." "Most people do," she said. "I'll figure him out." Cole looked at her for a moment with that quality of attention she still found slightly disorienting. Not uncomfortable exactly, just more than she was accustomed to receiving. "How are you finding it?" he asked. "Honestly?" She thought about it. The kitchen was good. The range was responsive once she'd learned its particular hotspots. The larder needed reorganizing, but it was full. The men were not hostile, Harlan aside, just watchful, the way working men were watchful around anyone new until that person proved their worth. Her room was small but had a window facing east, which felt like a sign of something, though she couldn't say what. "It's a lot," she said, which was the honest answer stripped down to its essentials. "Too much?" "I didn't say too much. I said a lot." She looked down at the ledger. "There's a difference?" He was quiet for a moment. "The supply list," he said. "You're changing the order." "I'm adding things and cutting things." She turned the ledger so he could see it. "You're spending too much on salt pork and not enough on dry goods. If I increase the flour and cornmeal order and reduce the pork by a third, I can stretch the budget further and give the men more variety. They're not going to complain about eating less salt pork." Cole studied the ledger. He had, she was realizing, the quality of actually looking at things when they were shown to him, rather than glancing and pretending. "Who taught you to think about it this way?" he said. "No one," she said. "I figured it out." The same thing she'd said about the cornbread, and she saw him recognize it, a slight shift at the corner of his mouth. "All right," he said, "change the order." He pushed off the door frame and went back out into the dark of the house, and she went back to her ledger, and that was the closest thing to approval she was going to get for a while. And it was, she decided, enough. For now. The weeks folded into each other the way weeks do on a working ranch, which is to say without much ceremony and with a great deal of repetition, each day differentiated from the last mainly by the weather and the particular crisis the livestock had decided to provide. November tipped into December. The first hard freeze came on a Thursday, coating everything in a silver skin overnight and cracking the water trough by morning, which put Walt and Cass into a state of grim industry for most of the day. Eliza kept coffee on the range all morning and brought it out twice without being asked, and Walt, who had not said more than 4 words to her in 2 weeks, accepted his cup with a look that was as close to warmth as his face probably got, and said, "Appreciate it. Small things." She collected them the way some people collected larger victories. She began to understand the ranch's rhythms. The hands were up before light and wanted hot food fast and without fuss. This was a working morning, not a social occasion. Midday was when Pete talked too much and someone, usually Dell, told him to shut up, and there was a joke or two, and the mood was generally lighter. Evenings were quieter, people worn down to their essentials by the day's work, wanting something warm and something that tasted like it had been made with care, and then they wanted to be left alone. She learned what each man needed, and she provided it, not sycophantically but practically, the way you address a real problem with a real solution. She started adding a little extra to Rodrigo's plate because she'd noticed he gave some of his food to the working dogs when he thought no one was looking. She found out that Jimmy, the youngest hand, had a bad tooth on the lower left and adapted his food accordingly for 2 weeks until he finally worked up the nerve to go into town and see the dentist. At which point, he came back looking both relieved and sheepish, and she baked him a peach cobbler with the last of the canned peaches in the larder and set it on the table without comment. He looked at her like she'd performed a miracle. She told herself she was just doing the job. Harlan remained the variable she couldn't quite solve. He was not, she had come to understand, a bad man. He was a man who organized the world into those who held authority and those who didn't, and her presence in this household occupied a category his framework didn't quite accommodate. She was not a hand. She was not family. She wasn't Hattie, who owned the place and could simply outrank him. She was something new, and new things made him suspicious. The confrontation, when it came, arrived on a Wednesday, 3 weeks into her trial. She had been in the larder doing end-of-week inventory when she came back into the kitchen and found Harlan at her work table, going through her ledger. Not looking, reading. His finger was moving along the page in the way of a man who reads slowly but deliberately, making sure he understands what he's seeing. She stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at him. He looked up. He did not look embarrassed, which told her something. "This supply order," he said. "You cut the pork allocation." "I did," she said. She came into the kitchen, took the ledger from the work table, and set it on the shelf behind her where it lived. "Mr. Mercer approved the change. The men are going to complain." "They haven't so far." "It's been 3 weeks," Harlan said. "Give it time. Or they won't, because they're eating better than they were on the old allocation, and they know it." She kept her voice level. "Harlan, what is it you actually want to say to me? Because we've been doing this since I arrived. You come in sideways, and I have to figure out what the real question is. Just say it." He looked at her for a long moment. The squint tightened, then slowly released. "How long are you staying?" he said. She hadn't expected that. "My trial is 6 weeks." "And after?" "That depends on Mr. Mercer." "Does it?" Harlan said, and there was something in his tone that she couldn't quite read. Not hostile exactly, but weighted, like the question meant something beyond its surface. "What does that mean?" she said. Harlan picked up his hat from the work table. He'd set it there when he came in, and she hadn't noticed it until now, and turned it in his hands. The same gesture Cole made. She wondered if it was something ranchmen learned, or just something the particular shape of uncertainty produced in people. "Cole Mercer is a good man," Harlan said finally. "He's the best employer I've had in 30 years. And I've watched a lot of people come through this ranch and leave, and every time one of them leaves, it costs him something he doesn't say out loud." He looked at her directly. "I just want to know what your intentions are." Eliza stared at him. "My intentions," she said, toward the ranch, toward—" He stopped, started again. "He vouched for you. He doesn't do that lightly." She held his gaze. There was something here she needed to be careful about, and she knew it. "I'm here to do a job," she said. "I'm doing it. At the end of 6 weeks, if Mr. Mercer wants to extend the arrangement, I'll consider it." Harlan nodded slowly, as though that was either what he'd hoped to hear or not quite what he'd hoped to hear. She couldn't tell which. "The pork," she said. "If the men genuinely miss it, I'll find a way to add it back. But I need a chance to make the decision first." Another nod. Then he put his hat on and went out through the back. She stood in the kitchen for a moment and thought about the question he'd actually been asking, which was not entirely about the pork allocation, and was not entirely about the supply ledger. She was not going to think about that today. She had bread to start, and a beef stew that needed 2 more hours on the range. She got back to work. December deepened. The cold became a permanent presence rather than a nightly visitor, settling into the bones of the house and requiring constant management. More wood, more banked fires, more checks on the livestock. The days were short and the work was long, and the evenings came early, settling over the ranch like something heavy and deliberate. She had a habit she'd developed at Hattie's of sitting up after the kitchen work was done, in the hour before she went to bed, just sitting quietly with a cup of tea, or occasionally nothing at all. At Hattie's, she'd done this in the kitchen, which was the only room that was reliably empty at that hour. At the ranch, she started doing it in the main room near the fireplace, because the kitchen was too cold after the range went down, and the main room held its heat better. She hadn't thought about whether Cole would be there. He was, the first time she came in. He was at the desk near the window going through papers, supply manifests and account books by the look of it, with the lamp turned up high and his coat off and his sleeves rolled to the elbow. He looked up when she came in. "Sorry," she said, starting to back out. "Don't," he said. I'm just doing accounts. There's room." She hesitated, then sat in the chair near the fireplace that she'd come to think of as the room's best chair. Not because it was grand, but because it caught the heat at the right angle. She had her tea. He had his papers. They didn't talk, not right away, and the not talking was, she discovered, comfortable. Not the uncomfortable quiet of two people avoiding something, but the easy quiet of two people who didn't require noise to fill the space between them. After a while, he said, without looking up, "Walt told me you brought coffee out during the freeze." "It was cold," she said. "They were working. He said it made a difference." "I'm glad." Another stretch of quiet. The fire worked its way through a log and resettled. "Harlan came to talk to me today," Cole said. She looked at him. He set down his pen. "He said you handled the supply disagreement well." A pause. "Coming from Harlan, that's... He doesn't say that about people." "He came to look at my ledger," she said. "I know. I told him not to. He did it anyway." Cole looked briefly frustrated in the way of a man dealing with someone whose behavior he can predict but not prevent. "I apologize for that." "He was worried about the ranch," she said. "That's his job. I can't be angry at him for doing his job, even if his method was..." She chose her word. "Direct." Cole looked at her. "You're more generous than I'd be." "I'm practical," she said, which was how she preferred to think about it. He picked his pen back up, but didn't immediately go back to the papers. He seemed to be considering something. "3 weeks in," he said. "How does it feel?" "Honestly, not the version you give me when you think I want reassurance." She looked at the fire and thought about honesty. "Some days it feels like I've been here forever," she said. "Not in a bad way, just like the shape of it fits. The work makes sense. I understand what's needed." She paused. "Other days I wake up and I'm not sure where I am for a moment. Not literally. I know where I am, but it's..." She looked for the word. "The strangeness of it. Of this being mine to take care of." He was quiet for a moment. "Does that bother you? The strangeness?" "It used to," she said. "Less now." He nodded, and she had the sense that he understood more of what she'd said than the surface of it. He was like that. He had a way of hearing the whole thing, not just the part that was spoken. "You've changed the household," he said. "The men, I don't mean they're different people, but there's something different in the mornings, something calmer." He shook his head slightly. "That's not just the food." Eliza looked at the fire and didn't answer, because she didn't know what to say to that, and she had learned that there were times when saying nothing was less dangerous than saying the wrong thing. She finished her tea. She told him good night and went to her room and lay in the dark listening to the wind work its way around the eaves of the house. And she thought about fit and strangeness, and the particular feeling of a shape you hadn't known you were looking for until you found yourself inside it. She thought about the east-facing window. She thought about what Cole had said. The woman who had first caught his attention, the cornbread, the hungry girl. And how one hungry night had led here, to this ranch, to this fire, to this specific silence that was not uncomfortable. She told herself she was not going to make anything of it. She was an employee. She had a trial to get through. She was practical and she was careful, and she did not attach herself to things that weren't hers. She told herself all of this very firmly in the dark, and then she fell asleep thinking about the way he'd said, "You've changed the household." Not what the household looked like, but what it felt like. And the fact that he'd noticed the difference at all. The 6-week trial ended on a Thursday in mid-December, and Cole came to the kitchen after supper with an expression she couldn't read, which was unusual because she'd gotten good at reading him. "You know what today is," he said. "I know," she said. She was drying the last of the supper plates, and she set them down and turned to face him, because this was the kind of conversation that deserved to happen with full attention. "I want you to stay," he said. It came out direct, which was his way. "Permanently. Or as permanently as you want it to be. The trial was a formality, I knew by the end of the first week." "Why didn't you say something sooner?" "Because I said I'd give you 6 weeks and I meant it. I wasn't going to pressure you into a decision before you'd had the time to actually make it." She looked at him and thought about that. About a man who said a thing and then kept to it. Not because he was rigid, but because his word meant something to him and he expected it to mean something. "What are the terms?" she said. "Same as now, plus a proper wage. More than Hattie was paying, I'll make sure of that. Your room, your kitchen, your ledger. He paused. And you can leave whenever you decide it's not working. I'll put that in writing the same way I put the trial in writing. She considered it. She had known, she realized, since somewhere around week 2, what her answer was going to be. But she'd spent years being careful, and she was not going to stop being careful now just because something felt right. Feeling right was not the same as being right, and she was old enough to know the difference. The biscuit debate, she said. He blinked. What about it? It's never going to be resolved. Probably not, he agreed. I can live with that, she said. The corner of his mouth moved. Is that a yes? That's a yes, she said. She held out her hand because that was how you confirmed an agreement, and he shook it, which was what you did when someone held out their hand, and they stood in the kitchen doorway in the December cold, shaking hands over a permanent position in a way that was perfectly practical and entirely appropriate, and also felt, to both of them, like something larger than its surface, though neither of them said so. She went back to her plates. He went back to his accounts. The fire in the main room burned through the night, and outside the first real snow of winter came down soft and steady over the Mercer Ranch, covering everything in a new and even white. The snow that had come down soft on the night she agreed to stay did not let up for 3 days. By the second morning, the ranch had taken on the particular closed-in quality that deep winter imposed on working land. The world reduced to what you could see from the porch, which was white in every direction, and the dark line of the fence post disappearing into it, and the sound of wind doing things to the roof that made you check the ceiling involuntarily. The cattle had been moved to the lower pasture where the windbreak was better. The hands worked shorter rotations because the cold at that latitude in December was not the kind you push through indefinitely. Everyone moved closer to the fire in the evenings without discussing it, the way people do when weather makes the choice for them. Eliza cooked more in those 3 days than she'd cooked in any 3 days at Hattie's. Not because she'd been asked to, but because it was what the situation called for. Hot food at every shift. A pot of something always on the range. Biscuits twice a day because the cold made people want bread the way it made them want everything warm and dense and real. She made a venison stew on the second night from a haunch that Walt had brought in from the cold cellar, and she cooked it low and slow for 4 hours with dried onion and the last of the root vegetables and a handful of herbs from the bundle she'd hung in the kitchen window to dry. The smell of it moved through the whole house by late afternoon. Cole came in from the south pasture that evening with ice in the crease of his hat brim and a look on his face that was the specific exhaustion of a man who has spent 8 hours in the cold worrying about something he can't entirely control. He sat down at the kitchen table, not the main room, the kitchen, which surprised her, and put his hat on the table and his head in his hands for a moment. She set a bowl in front of him without comment. He looked up. He looked at the bowl. He picked up the spoon. Neither of them said anything for a while. The range ticked and settled. Outside, the wind made its case against the north wall of the house. "Lost 2 calves today," he said finally. Not to her specifically, just into the room. She had known something was wrong by the set of his shoulders when he came in. "I'm sorry," she said. She meant it simply, without decoration. "It happens." He said it the way people say things they know are true, but don't find comforting. "They were early, shouldn't have been born until March. Nothing to be done about it." "That doesn't make it easier." "No," he said. "It doesn't." He ate a few spoonfuls. "This is good." "I know," she said, which surprised a short sound out of him that was almost a laugh. "Not modest," he said. "About the cooking?" "No, I know what I do well." She was drying the last of the afternoon's dishes, her back partly to him, which felt easier for this particular conversation. "You can be modest about things you're uncertain about. I've been cooking for 12 years. I'm not uncertain about it." "Fair," he said. He ate in silence for a moment. "The hands are saying you're the best cook they've had on this ranch." "Who said that?" "Pete, mostly. But Pete says everything out loud that the others are thinking quietly." A pause. "Rodrigo told me in his way. He's been eating properly for the first time since August." She didn't say anything. She set the last plate on the shelf. "Harlan told me you two had it out about the supply ledger." "We came to an understanding," she said carefully. "He said you held your ground." "I did." "Good." Cole set his spoon down and looked at the empty bowl like he was considering something. "Eliza." It was the first time he'd used her first name without the miss in front of it, and it landed differently. She registered the difference and set it aside. I want to ask you something, and I need you to answer it honestly, not the way you think I want you to answer it. She turned from the shelf. All right? Are you all right here? Not the work, not the kitchen. You, personally. Because I know what you left in Callan. It wasn't much, maybe, but it was yours. And I know what it costs a person to start over somewhere new, and I want this to work for both of us. I want you to... He stopped, and she watched him struggle briefly with the sentence, which was the most unguarded she'd seen him. I want you to actually be all right, not just managing. She looked at him for a long moment. I'm all right, she said. And then, because he'd asked her to be honest, some days more than others, the mornings are the hardest. I wake up and there's a moment before I'm fully awake where I don't know where I am, and then I do know, and I have to decide again how I feel about it. She paused. But then I come into the kitchen and there's work to do. And the work I understand. It's the rest of it I'm still figuring out. The rest of it, he said. Being somewhere, she said. Not just passing through. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind found a gap somewhere and the lamp on the wall flickered. You're not passing through, he said. I want that to be clear. She nodded once and went back to the kitchen, and he finished his stew, and later she heard him go upstairs, and she sat in the kitchen in the quiet of the house and the wind and thought about what not passing through meant to a woman who had been doing exactly that her entire life. Winter settled in properly after the snow, the way winters did in this part of the country. Not dramatically, not all at once, but with the patient insistence of something that had been coming for a long time and knew it had nowhere to be. January was hard work and not much light. February was harder work and even less. Eliza learned the ranch's cold weather rhythms the way she'd learned its harvest rhythms, by paying attention and adjusting. She learned which hands ran cold and which ran warm, which ones needed food before they could think properly in the morning, and which ones could function on coffee until midday. She learned that Walt's joints bothered him in the cold, though he never said so, and she started putting a second cup of strong coffee at his place without comment. She learned that Jimmy was afraid of being useless. He was the youngest, and he felt it keenly, especially in winter when the work slowed and he couldn't compensate for inexperience with energy. She found things for him to do around the kitchen and the house, small repairs and fetch and carry work that wasn't beneath him but gave him somewhere to put himself. She learned that Cole woke up at 5 in the morning every day without fail, that he took his coffee black without sugar, that he sat at the kitchen table in the dark for 20 minutes before he went out to start the day, and that he did not want to talk during this time and was entirely different afterward. She started getting up at 4:45 to have the coffee ready. She told herself it was just part of the job. It was not just part of the job. The understanding of this arrived not as a revelation but as something quieter. The way you notice, gradually, that a season has changed not on the day it changes, but some weeks later, when you realize you've been living in the new one for a while already. She noticed it on a morning in late February when she came into the kitchen in the dark and started the coffee and heard his boots on the stairs at 5 exactly and felt her shoulders relax slightly at the sound. A physical response, involuntary, the body confirming something the mind was still working up to. She kept her back to the door. She poured the coffee. She set it on the table. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she said. She went back to the range and started the breakfast prep and did not examine the particular quality of the silence between them, because examining it would require deciding something, and she was not ready to decide anything. She thought about what she was risking. She had a position. She had a kitchen. She had a room with an east-facing window and a ledger that was hers, and the respect, slowly earned, of 7 men who had started out treating her as a trial and were now treating her as something permanent. She had, for the first time in her life, a version of belonging that was solid enough to stand on. She was not going to destabilize that by wanting something she hadn't been offered. She was going to be careful. She was going to be practical. She was very good at both of these things. The problem was that Cole Mercer was not making it easy to be practical. It wasn't anything he said. It was the way he noticed things, the way he remembered what she'd told him. Not just the big things, but the small ones, the offhand mentions, the details that most people let go through without catching. She had mentioned once, in passing, that she'd never seen a newborn calf. On the first morning in March, when one of the heifers in the lower barn went into labor, he came to the kitchen before 6 and said simply, "If you want to see it, now's the time." She wiped her hands on her apron and went. She stood in the cold dim of the barn and watched Rodrigo and Cole work, quiet and steady and serious, talking to the heifer in low voices, their breath making small clouds in the lantern light. The calf arrived in the way of most arrivals. Not gracefully, not without difficulty, but eventually, stubbornly, with all the determination of something that had decided to exist. It was wet and ungainly, and its legs were cartoonishly uncertain, and it tried to stand 3 times before it managed it. And when it finally did, trembling and indignant in the straw, Eliza felt something in her chest that she could not have named if she'd tried. She became aware that Cole was watching her instead of the calf. "Worth getting up for?" he said. She looked at him. There was something in his expression that was careful and warm at the same time, the way someone looks when they've done something for you that they're not sure you'll accept. "Yes," she said. "Thank you." He nodded once. He went back to tending to the calf. She stood in the barn doorway in the cold for another 10 minutes, watching the small, ungainly animal find its legs, and then she went back to the kitchen to start breakfast. She did not think about his expression. She thought about it constantly. Spring came late that year, arriving in fits and starts through March and April, teasing the land with warm days and then pulling back to frost again. The ranch shifted from winter mode to something more expansive. More hands during planting and branding season, more work in every direction, the days stretching longer at both ends. Eliza expanded accordingly. She was feeding more people, managing more supplies, coordinating the logistics of the household around the variable demands of the land's seasonal calendar. She was good at it. She allowed herself to privately admit, better than good. She also started making small changes to the house that were slightly outside the strict definition of her kitchen duties. She repaired the loose hinge on the front gate herself one morning because it bothered her every time she saw it, and she knew where the tools were. She put curtains on the main room windows because the glass without covering leaked cold in winter and heat in summer, and she'd had a bolt of cotton duck fabric left over from recovering a storage box. She organized the main room's shelves without being asked because the disorganization of them made her quietly insane every time she walked through. Cole noticed each of these things. He didn't say much about them, but she'd catch him sometimes, looking at the curtains or the gate, with an expression that wasn't quite surprise, just something she couldn't entirely read. Harlan noticed too. His attitude toward her had shifted over the months into something she would have called, carefully, respect. Not warmth. Harlan wasn't built for warmth, but a solid professional regard, the kind you give someone who has demonstrated repeatedly that they understand what they're doing. He started consulting her sometimes about logistics, which days she'd need extra provisions, whether the kitchen could handle feeding 2 extra hands during peak branding weeks. He came through the kitchen door now instead of standing in it. One afternoon in April, she was in the garden. She had started a kitchen garden along the south wall of the house in March, and it was her particular project, the one thing that was entirely and only hers, when she heard raised voices from the direction of the barn. She looked up. Pete Hauser was coming across the yard at a fast walk, and his face was the color of something that meant trouble. "Need you to come," he said. "Jimmy's hurt." She was already moving before he finished the sentence. Jimmy had managed to catch his left hand between 2 fence rails during a repair, and while nothing was broken, she established this fairly quickly, running her fingers carefully along each bone while he turned a remarkable shade of white. The damage to 2 of his fingers was significant enough that he was going to be out of heavy work for at least 3 weeks. He was sitting on an overturned bucket in the barn, with his hand wrapped in the cloth she'd pressed against it, and trying very hard not to make any sound that would embarrass him in front of the other hands. "It's not broken," she told him, "but you're going to have to be careful with it." "I'm fine," Jimmy said, which was what 19-year-old men said when they were not fine. "You're not fine, but you will be." She adjusted the pressure of the wrapping. "You're going to need to keep it elevated tonight. I'll make a proper bandage after supper." He looked at her with the expression she'd come to know from him, the one that mixed gratitude and the desire not to need the gratitude. "I don't want to be a burden," he said. "You're not a burden," she said. "You're a person who got hurt doing his job. Those are different things." He blinked, and she saw in his face that this was not something anyone had said to him before in exactly this way. Cole came into the barn while she was finishing. He took in the scene. Jimmy on the bucket, Eliza's wrapped hand, the general state of controlled calm, and he asked one question. How bad? Manageable, she said. He'll need lighter work for a few weeks. Cole nodded. He looked at Jimmy. You did good work today before this happened, he said. Get some rest. Jimmy nodded with the relieved look of a young man who had been afraid of the wrong thing. Later, after supper, and the bandaging and the sending of Jimmy to bed early, Eliza was in the kitchen when Cole came in. She was sitting at the work table for once instead of standing at it, which was unusual. She almost never sat in the kitchen. She had her hands around a cup of tea, and she was not doing anything in particular, just sitting with the quiet of the empty kitchen and the low light of the single lamp. Cole sat across from her. He didn't ask if he could. He just sat, the way he sat at his desk in the main room. Like he'd decided the room was where he was going to be and didn't need to make an occasion of it. You handled that well today, he said. I just kept him calm, she said. That's handling it well. He looked at his hands on the table. A habit she'd noticed. He looked at his hands when he was thinking. Eliza, can I ask you something? You can ask me things, Cole. She had started using his first name sometime in February without deciding to, and he had not acknowledged it, which she'd taken as permission. Why did you stay? After the 6 weeks? I know I offered you good terms, but you had options. Callan would have taken you back. Other places would have taken you. She thought about it. I told you I'd stay, she said. That's not why, he said. She looked at him. He was right, and they both knew it. Because it fit, she said, which was what she'd told him before. But she meant something more by it now, and she suspected he knew that too. Because I wake up in the morning and I know where I am and what I'm doing, and it matters. What I do here matters to actual people, not to a business, not to a table of strangers who'll eat their food and not look at me. To people I know. She paused. To a place. The lamp on the wall made its small light between them. I need to tell you something, Cole said. He said it in the tone of someone who has been building up to a thing for a long time and has finally decided to get there. And I want you to hear the whole thing before you say anything. She set her cup down. When you first came here, he said, I told myself it was about the kitchen, about finding someone competent to run the household. That was true. It was also not the whole truth. He was looking at his hands again, then he looked up. I came back to Hattie's because of you, not the food. Not even, yes, the cornbread was extraordinary, but it wasn't that. It was what I saw, what I kept seeing every time I was in that room. The way you moved through a space full of people who weren't looking at you, like you'd made your peace with it, like you decided invisibility was something you could live inside. And I kept thinking, he stopped. I kept thinking that was wrong, that it was wrong for a person like you to be invisible, that whoever you were, you deserved to be seen. Eliza was very still. And then I got to know you, he said. And it turned out that the cook at Hattie's was actually the most capable person I'd encountered in years, who could read a room the way most people can't read a book, and who gave away her own supper without a second thought, and who faced down Harlan, which takes more nerve than most grown men have, and who got up before 5 in the morning to make sure the coffee was ready, which nobody asked her to do. He stopped. His jaw was tight in the way it got when he was holding something carefully. And somewhere in the last 4 months, I stopped noticing those things as qualities of an employee and started noticing them as Cole, she said. I'm not finished, he said. She waited. I don't need a cook anymore, he said. I do, obviously. The men have to eat. But that's not... He pushed back from the table slightly, ran one hand over his face, and she realized, with something moving in her chest, that Cole Mercer was nervous. Genuinely, thoroughly nervous. The way she'd never seen him before. This man who rode out into blizzards and talked to his frightened cattle in low, calm voices and shook hands on agreements without hesitating. I need you to stay, not in the kitchen, not in the role, just here, on this ranch, with me. He met her eyes fully. I'm asking if you'd consider marrying me. I know it's large. I know there are things we haven't said out loud. But I know what I know about you, Eliza, and what I know is that this place hasn't felt like what it's supposed to feel like in a long time. And since December it has, and the difference is you." The lamplight held very still. Eliza looked at him across the table. This man she had watched every morning for 4 months, whose hat he turned in his hands when he was uncertain, whose face went absolutely shut when he was in pain, who had brought her to a barn in the dark to see a calf born, because she'd mentioned once in passing that she never had. And she felt the full weight of what was being offered. She also felt, running under it like a current, the fear, the specific, familiar, deeply ingrained fear of the woman who has spent her life being careful with herself because nobody else was going to be careful on her behalf. The fear that said, "This is too much. This is more than your portion. What makes you think this holds?" She had listened to that fear for 23 years. She was profoundly tired of it. "I need to ask you something first," she said. He nodded. He was holding himself very still. "You see me," she said. "I know that. I've known it since the night in Hattie's kitchen. But this ranch, this life, it's hard. And it's going to stay hard. And there are going to be days when the cattle die and the weather comes wrong and the money doesn't stretch. And I burn the biscuits and you're exhausted and—" She stopped. "I need to know that you're not asking me because I'm useful. Because I've spent my whole life being useful to people. And that's not— I can't build a life on being useful." Cole looked at her for a long moment. "The ranch would run without you," he said quietly. "Not as well. But it would run. I'd hire someone else. The kitchen would be managed." He paused. "I can't replace what I'd lose if you left. I don't know what to call it exactly, but I know it's not a position I'm filling." She breathed. "All right," she said. He blinked. "All right?" "Yes," she said. "I'll marry you." And then because she was who she was. "But I'm keeping the kitchen." Something in his face broke open. Not into a dramatic expression, not into anything you could photograph and point to, just a slight, complete release of tension that had clearly been building for a long time. He exhaled. "The kitchen is yours," he said, "and I make the biscuit decisions." "You always have," he said. She almost smiled. This time she let it happen. Outside, the April night was cold, but not bitterly cold, the kind of cold that knew it was losing ground. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the kitchen window, the first tentative frogs of spring were making their small, persistent argument for warmth. The lamp burned between them. The house was quiet. She had gone her whole life being the woman nobody noticed. She did not yet know what it would feel like to be the woman someone chose. That understanding was still ahead of her, in all the ordinary and difficult days that were coming. The arguments and the bad seasons and the slow work of learning what it meant to be truly known by another person, which was harder and stranger and more worth it than she could currently imagine. But sitting in the kitchen in the lamplight with the coffee cold and the spring frogs loud outside, she felt, for the first time in her life, the particular sensation of not having to hold herself so tightly, of being in a place that was not going to require her to prove she deserved to be in it. She picked up her teacup. He picked up his coffee. Neither of them said anything else for a while. The frogs went on making their case outside, and the house held its warmth around them, and that was enough, more than enough, for one April night. The news traveled, the way news always traveled in a county this size. Not in a straight line, but in the irregular overlapping pattern of people telling other people who told someone else entirely, each retelling adding a layer of interpretation until the original fact was still recognizable, but surrounded by the particular texture of community speculation. Cole Mercer was getting married. To Hattie's cook. That second piece of information was the one that gave people pause, and the pause itself said everything about how the town had regarded Eliza Hart for the 3 years she'd lived among them. Not unkindly. That was the thing she would have to square with herself later. Nobody had been unkind to her exactly. They just hadn't been paying attention. And now they were, all at once, with the collective energy of people suddenly realizing they had missed something that was standing right in front of them the whole time. Eliza heard about the town's reaction secondhand from Mrs. Delaney, who came by the ranch on a Wednesday in late April with a basket of early rhubarb and an expression that suggested she had things to say. "People are talking," Mrs. Delaney said, setting the basket on the kitchen table with the authority of a woman delivering news she fully intends to elaborate on. "I assumed they would be," Eliza said. She was rolling out pastry dough, and she did not stop. Clara Hatch said she always thought there was something, and I'm quoting her directly, quietly remarkable about you. Mrs. Delaney sat down without being invited, which was her habit. Clara Hatch, who came into Hattie's dining room at least once a week for 2 years, and I'm quite certain never learned your name. She didn't, Eliza confirmed. She called me miss when she called me anything at all. Well, now she claims she always sensed your potential. Mrs. Delaney's tone was dry enough to start a fire in wet weather. The postmaster says he isn't surprised at all, which means he is completely surprised. And Margaret Foley, Margaret Foley, runs the dry goods on the east corner. She apparently told half the women's circle that she once saw you help an old man pick up his dropped parcels in the street, and thought to herself that you seemed like a person of considerable character. Eliza stopped rolling. She watched me pick up someone's parcels and filed it away. People notice things they can't explain at the time, Mrs. Delaney said. They just don't know what to do with the noticing until there's a reason for it. She looked at Eliza directly. How are you feeling about all this? Truly. The pastry cutter moved in a slow circle. Strange, Eliza said. It feels strange to suddenly be visible to people who spent years looking through me. I don't know if I'm grateful or just confused. You can be both, Mrs. Delaney said. That's permitted. I know it is. It just doesn't feel clean. Mrs. Delaney was quiet for a moment, and in that quiet, Eliza appreciated her more than she usually did, which was already considerably. It never feels clean, the older woman said finally. Recognition that arrives late carries its own kind of weight. You're allowed to feel the weight of it. She reached over and broke a small piece off the edge of the pastry scraps and ate it without ceremony. But you're also allowed to enjoy the part where everyone suddenly realizes they were wrong about you. That part is at least a little satisfying. Eliza looked at her sideways. A little, she admitted. The wedding was set for the 3rd week of May, which gave them 4 weeks to prepare. Eliza had no family to notify. This fact, which would have felt like an absence before, now carried a different texture. She was building a family, not arriving without one, and the distinction mattered to her in ways she was still working out. What she had not anticipated was the letter. It arrived on a Thursday, 7 days after the engagement became known in Callan. The handwriting on the envelope was careful and institutional, the kind developed over years of record-keeping rather than personal correspondence. The return address was the Millhaven County Orphanage. She sat with the envelope in her hands for a long moment before she opened it. The letter was from a woman named Sister Agnes Pruitt, who had managed the orphanage's daily operations for as long as Eliza could remember. A solid, sharp-eyed woman in her 60s who had never been unkind to Eliza, but had never been what you'd call warm either. She was the kind of woman who expressed care through action rather than language, who made sure you had shoes that fit and didn't send you to school in weather without a proper coat, and found you a position in the kitchen when your hands were capable and the work needed doing. Warmth, for Sister Agnes, was a luxury the institution's resources didn't extend to. Efficiency was what she had. The letter said, in the direct way of its author, "We heard the news through Reverend Hatch's wife, who corresponds with our matron. We would like to attend, if that is acceptable. There are 4 of us who remember you well and would be glad to see you on a day like this. We will make our own arrangements for travel and lodging. You need only say yes or no." Eliza read it twice. She had not thought about the orphanage much since leaving it, or rather, she had thought about it the way you think about the house where you grew up, when the house was not particularly happy and not particularly unhappy, just a place that shaped you in ways you don't fully catalog until much later. She had not thought of Sister Agnes as someone who had a feeling about her one way or another. She wrote back that afternoon, "Yes, you are welcome. I am glad." She did not tell Cole about the letter until 2 days later, in the evening, when they were sitting in the main room, him with his accounts, her with the mending she'd started doing in the evenings because there was always mending on a working ranch, and it gave her hands something to do while her mind was going. She told him plainly, the way she told him most things. What the letter was, what it said, what she'd written back. He set down his pen and looked at her. "You didn't ask me," he said. "It's 4 people," she said. "They'll manage their own lodging." "That's not what I mean." She looked at him. "I know it's not." She set down the mending. "I suppose I thought, I've spent so long making decisions on my own that I didn't think to. I should have mentioned it first. I want them there, he said. I want anyone there who matters to you. That's not the issue. He picked his pen back up. I just want you to remember that you have someone to consult now. That's allowed. She held that for a moment. That's going to take some getting used to, she said. I know, he said, for both of us. The wedding preparations were, in their way, a test of a different kind than the kitchen had been. Not because of Cole. He had opinions about almost none of it, beyond the date and the location, which he said should be on the ranch, on the front porch in the yard, because this was the land that meant something to him, and he wanted the thing that meant the most to him to happen on it. The test was the town. Callan arrived, collectively and with some force, bearing opinions. Margaret Foley insisted on providing the decorative bunting, which she did with the enthusiasm of a woman who had decided retroactively that she had always been fond of Eliza and was going to demonstrate this through fabric. Clara Hatch organized a small committee of women from the church circle to assist with the wedding meal, which required Eliza to very delicately but very firmly establish that the wedding meal was being prepared by her, and the committee was welcome to contribute but not to reorganize. This conversation happened in the dry goods store and required more diplomacy than anything she'd managed with Harlan. We only want to help, Clara said. I appreciate that, Eliza said. Here is specifically how you can help. And she produced a list, which she had written in advance because she had anticipated this conversation with some accuracy. Clara took the list with the look of a woman slightly unmoored by having her helpfulness directed at something specific. The women of the circle, having been given clear instructions, turned out to be genuinely useful. Margaret Foley's bunting was actually lovely. The woman who ran the church ladies' auxiliary contributed 4 dozen sugar cookies that were frankly better than anything Eliza would have made herself, and she said so, which made the woman, a Mrs. Timmons, whom Eliza had previously known only as the woman who always sat at the window table at Hattie's and ordered the same thing every Tuesday, look startled and then very pleased. Small adjustments, new versions of old distances. Sister Agnes arrived on a Thursday, 2 days before the wedding, with 3 other women from the orphanage, 2 younger staff members Eliza remembered less clearly, and old Mrs. Birch, who had managed the orphanage's laundry for 20 years, and who embraced Eliza on the front porch of the Mercer Ranch with a fierceness that was entirely unexpected and made Eliza's throat close. You look well, Sister Agnes said. She stood on the porch and looked at the house and the yard and the land with the assessing eyes of a woman who had spent decades evaluating the suitability of environments for people in her care. This is good land. It is, Eliza said. And the man? Is good also. Sister Agnes looked at her for a long moment. She had the particular quality of attention that came from having watched a great many children grow up, which was that she missed very little. You were always better than you believed yourself to be, she said. That was my failure as much as anything. We didn't tell the children what they were worth. We were too busy keeping the place running. A pause. I'm sorry for that. Eliza looked at her. You kept us fed and warm, she said. You found me the kitchen. That was enough. That was more than enough. Sister Agnes nodded once, briskly, in the way of a woman who has said the thing she came to say and is glad to have said it. Cole met them on the porch and shook Sister Agnes's hand with the direct, unpretentious courtesy that Eliza had come to recognize as simply who he was, and offered them the use of the main room for as long as they needed it, and went back to his work without making an occasion of it. She watched Sister Agnes register this and file it in the same way she'd once filed Eliza's work in the kitchen, efficiently, without excessive commentary, as evidence that a situation was what it appeared to be. The wedding day arrived on a Saturday of genuine spring, not the tentative hedging spring that had occupied April, but the committed kind, warm without the heat of summer, with the particular pale green light of new leaves and the sound of the ranch's working life providing an unrehearsed backdrop. Rodrigo had combed the horses. Pete had pressed his only good shirt and looked both proud and uncomfortable in it. Jimmy, whose hand had healed well but still carried a faint trace of the injury in the way he held it, had picked wildflowers from the fence line and put them in an empty mason jar on the porch railing, which was the most romantic gesture anyone on the property had ever witnessed, and which he denied having done when Pete brought it up. Eliza dressed in her room. She had made the dress herself, over the winter, from a bolt of blue-gray wool serge she'd ordered from the catalog. Not white, which was impractical, but something better. the color of early morning sky over the ridge, the color she'd been looking at every morning from her east-facing window since December. She had no mirror large enough to see the whole effect, which meant she had to trust the work of her own hands, which was, she thought, probably fitting. There was a knock at the door. Sister Agnes. The older woman came in, looked at her, and said nothing for a moment. Then she opened the small bag she was carrying and took out a thin silver chain with a simple pendant, a small oval of dark stone, polished smooth. "This was your mother's," she said. "It came with you. I kept it because you were too young to have it, and then I should have given it to you when you left. I'm sorry I didn't." Eliza took the chain in both hands. She looked at it for a long time. She had no memory of her mother. She had a few facts, names on an intake form, a county, and a year. The kind of information that told you the shape of a life without giving you the person inside it. She had long since made her peace with the absence, or something that functioned like peace. But holding the chain, small and cool in her palm, she felt the absence differently. Not as loss exactly, but as connection. A thin thread running backward through time to someone she'd never known, who had, at minimum, carried her into the world. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. Sister Agnes clasped the chain around her neck without ceremony. They stood in the small room together for a moment, the sound of the ranch and the town and the assembled people outside coming through the window in a low, complicated murmur. "Ready?" Sister Agnes said. Eliza looked at the east-facing window. The morning light came through it at its usual angle, familiar and reliable, the same light she'd been waking up to for months. "Yes," she said. The porch and yard of the Mercer Ranch were full. This was the thing she had not anticipated, Muck. Not the number of people, but the specific people. The ranch hands, all 7 of them, cleaned up and awkward in their good clothes. Mrs. Delaney in the front, openly crying already and making no attempt to conceal it. Sister Agnes and the women from Millhaven standing to one side with the particular straight-back dignity of people who have traveled through winter to witness something and are determined to witness it properly. And the town. Callan had come in numbers she hadn't expected, spilling from the yard onto the road. People she knew by face and function, if not by name. All of them turned toward the porch with an expression she didn't know how to read at first. Then she understood it. They were proud of her. Or proud of having known her, which was a complicated and slightly lesser thing, but it was what people had available to offer, and she was going to accept it. Cole was standing at the far end of the porch. He had dressed carefully. His best coat, a clean shirt, his hair combed into temporary submission. And he looked exactly like what he was. A man who was not entirely comfortable in formal clothes, but was wearing them anyway because the occasion required it. He was holding his hat in his hands, turning it in the old gesture, and she almost laughed because of course he was. When he saw her, he stopped turning the hat. She walked the length of the porch to stand in front of him, and the crowd in the yard went quiet, in the way crowds do when something real is happening in front of them. The words were simple. The man who said them was a traveling minister who had been in the county for a circuit and had agreed to perform the ceremony with the plain efficiency of someone who had done this many times and understood that the ceremony was not the point. The people were. He said the necessary things. Cole said yes. Eliza said yes. When it was done, the yard made its noise. Not the polished, orchestrated response of a formal occasion, but the honest, somewhat ragged sound of a crowd of people who are genuinely pleased about something. Pete Hauser shouted something that was enthusiastic and not quite intelligible. Mrs. Delaney had progressed from crying to laughing and was doing both simultaneously. Rodrigo, who was not a man of large expressions, was smiling in a way that took up his whole face. Harlan was standing at the back of the crowd. When Eliza looked at him, he touched the brim of his hat once, deliberately. She nodded back. It was enough. From Harlan, it was more than enough. The food, when it came, was everything she'd planned. Her best work laid out on tables in the yard. Real food, the kind that told people they were cared for. The ranch hands ate with the enthusiasm of men who knew exactly what had gone into the preparation and were appropriately grateful. The town ate with the slightly self-conscious pleasure of people attending an event they hadn't expected to enjoy quite this much. Sister Agnes ate her plate entirely and asked for the recipe for the honey-glazed carrots, which was the highest compliment the woman was capable of offering. At some point in the afternoon, Eliza found herself standing at the edge of the yard, slightly apart from the noise and movement of the gathering, just for a moment. She could see the whole of it from where she stood. The decorated porch, the tables, the hands and the townspeople, and the Millhaven women all occupying the same space with a comfort that surprised her. She could see Cole at the center of a group of men, talking with the ease of someone who was on his own land, which he was. He caught her eye across the distance and held it for a moment, just long enough to be a thing. She had spent her life perfecting invisibility, learning to take up exactly as much space as she needed and no more. Learning to be useful in ways that didn't require anyone to look at her directly. Today, for the first time in her 23 years, every eye in the yard had followed her. Not because she was performing anything, not because she had dressed for it or angled for it or managed it in any way, just because she was here and she was the reason everyone else was here, and that simply and completely was enough. She looked out at the ridgeline beyond the property, the dark edge of it against the afternoon sky. She thought about the east-facing window. She thought about the cornbread. She thought about the girl with the rope belt and what one hungry night of ordinary kindness had set in motion. Then Cole appeared at her elbow, with a plate and a look that said he'd noticed she hadn't eaten yet. "You need to eat at your own wedding," he said. "I know that," she said. "Then eat," he said, and handed her the plate, and she took it, and they stood together at the edge of their yard and ate, while their people made noise around them in the afternoon light. She was not invisible anymore. She had not been, for a long time now. She was just beginning to believe it. 20 years is long enough to change the shape of a life so completely that the person you were at the beginning of it is almost unrecognizable to the person you become at the end. Not because the original person was wrong, exactly, but because living, real living, the kind that includes loss and argument and children and bad seasons and the slow negotiation of two people trying to build something together without fully knowing what they're building, that kind of living leaves marks. It changes the architecture of you. And if you're fortunate, if you've chosen well and held on through the parts that required holding on, what you arrive at on the other side of 20 years is something sturdier and stranger and more specific than anything you could have designed at the start. Eliza Mercer understood this in the way that people understand things they've lived rather than learned. The ranch had grown, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the incremental way of things built on sound judgment. A parcel of land added here, a better breeding arrangement there. 2 more hands taken on in the years when the cattle market ran good and the range could support expansion. The herd was 3 times what it had been when Eliza arrived on a winter wagon with a carpet bag and 6 weeks of uncertainty ahead of her. The house had been expanded twice. Once when the first 2 children arrived close together and the upstairs rooms proved inadequate, and once when Cole's younger brother came out from the east with his wife and stayed long enough to build his own structure on the south corner of the property, which he was still in 12 years later. There were 4 children. This was the number they had arrived at through the combination of intention and the particular unpredictability of such things. The oldest was a girl named Clara, who was 19 and had her father's eyes and her mother's way of reading a room and had already decided she was going to study law, which nobody in the county had quite figured out what to do with yet, but which everyone who knew her accepted as inevitable. Then 2 boys, Thomas, 16, and Will, 13, who shared enough characteristics to be unmistakably brothers and enough differences to have spent the better part of their childhoods in low-level competition that occasionally escalated. And then the youngest, a girl of 9 named Ruth, who had arrived late and unexpected, and who had the quality, common to youngest children in large families, of being entirely comfortable at the center of any room. The kitchen was still Eliza's. This had never been seriously disputed. Cole had understood from the first week of their marriage, if not before, that the kitchen was not a room but a jurisdiction, and one that operated on its own logic. The children had learned it early. You could come in, you could ask, you could sit at the work table and do your lessons while supper was being made, but you did not reorganize anything, and you did not eat from the cooling rack without asking first. These were the laws. They were enforced with the calm consistency of someone who had been managing larger rooms for longer. The ranch hands had changed over the years. Pete and Del Hauser had moved on. Pete to a spread 2 counties east where he'd eventually become a foreman himself, Del to a quieter life in town that suited his temperament better. Rodrigo had stayed for 11 years before returning to his family in the South, and the farewell had been the kind that happens when you realize a person had been part of the structure of your daily life for so long that you'd stopped noticing them as a presence and started experiencing them as a feature of the place itself. Jimmy, who had grown from 19 to 35 on the Mercer payroll, was now the foreman, having surpassed both his own youthful uncertainty and the bad tooth that had plagued his early months on the ranch. He ran the operation with a competence that still occasionally surprised him, though it had long since stopped surprising anyone else. Harlan had retired 4 years ago, at 63, to a small house in town that his daughter had set up for him. He came out to the ranch twice a year in spring and before winter for what he called checking in and what was actually the specific need of a man who had spent 30 years on working land to reassure himself that it was still running properly. He and Eliza had arrived, over 2 decades, at a relationship that was not exactly friendship, but was considerably more than tolerance. A mutual regard between two people who had tested each other early and come out the other side knowing something real about who the other person was. His last visit in October, he had sat at the kitchen table and drunk his coffee and said, with the directness that had never changed in him, "Place looks good." "It is good," Eliza had said. "How's Cole?" "Stubborn. Tired sometimes." "Good." Harlan had nodded and drunk his coffee and said nothing else. And that had been enough, because by now enough was a language they both spoke. The November that marked their 20th anniversary was not a dramatically different November from any of the ones before it. The weather turned in the second week, the first hard frost coming down on a Tuesday and coating the fence lines silver by morning. Thomas was riding for the lower herd. Will was in school, enduring his final year with the focused resentment of a boy who knew exactly what he wanted to do with his life and was impatient with the formal requirements standing between him and it. Ruth was in the kitchen most afternoons, which was her habit. She had developed, with no particular encouragement, the same instinct for the room that her mother had, the same ease with the range and the work table, and the particular intelligence of knowing what food could do for people. Eliza watched this without comment for a long time. Then one afternoon she handed Ruth a bowl and a recipe she'd never written down and said, "Tell me what you think needs to change in that." Ruth looked at the recipe, looked at the bowl, looked at her mother with the expression that 9-year-olds deploy when they're being offered something serious. Then she went to work. She changed 2 things. She was right about both of them. Eliza didn't tell her immediately. She let her finish, let her taste the result, let her decide for herself. Then she said, "You were right. Remember what you changed." Ruth looked at her. "Why?" "Because it'll matter someday," Eliza said, "and you should know what you know." Cole found her in the kitchen later that evening, after Ruth had gone to bed and Thomas had come in from the cold, and the house had settled into its nighttime version of itself. Quieter, warmer, more particular. He was the way he always was at the end of a long day, coat still on, hat in his hands, the tiredness of the day sitting in the set of his shoulders. He was 47 years old, and the years of outdoor work had done what they always did to a man who spent them outdoors. The lines in his face were deeper. The gray at his temples was more than a suggestion, and he moved with the careful deliberateness of someone who knew what his knees were going to say in the morning. He was, she thought, without the particular sentimentality of the thought. He was simply who he was, unchanged in the ways that mattered. She poured his coffee. He sat at the kitchen table. This was still their ritual, 20 years on, the coffee in the morning before he went out, and sometimes a quiet moment in the evening when the day was done and the house was winding down. The particular comfort of being in a room with someone without needing the room to perform anything. "The anniversary," he said. "I know what day it is," she said. 20 years. "Yes." She sat across from him. "Do you want me to say something ceremonial?" "I want you to say whatever you want to say," he said. "That's always been my preference." She looked at him across the table. The lamp between them was the same style as the one from that first April evening. Different lamp, same light. The kitchen was different, larger, better equipped, marked with 20 years of use and care, but the particular quality of the evening, the two of them at the table at the end of a day, felt like the oldest thing she knew. "I want to tell you something," she said. "I should have told you a long time ago. I don't know why I didn't." He set down his coffee cup and gave her his full attention, which was something he'd always been able to do. Just turned toward you completely, like nothing else was pulling at him. "The cornbread," she said, "that night at Hattie's, when you came back into the kitchen." "I remember it," he said. "You said you'd smelled it from across the room, and you wanted to compliment the cook." She paused. "That cornbread wasn't for the house. I hadn't made a pan for the house, so there wasn't enough flour for a proper pan. I made it for myself. It was my supper." Cole was very still. "I know you figured that out," she said. "You told me later you'd guessed. But what I never told you, what I've never told anyone, is that I didn't decide to give it away. Not exactly. I heard her coughing in the hallway and I went and got it and gave it to her. I didn't think about it. I didn't weigh it. I just did it because it was the only thing I had that could help her, and she needed it more than I did." She looked at her hands on the table. "And then I was standing in that kitchen with nothing to eat, and I was so tired and so hungry, and I thought, this is what your life is. This is what it's always going to be. You give the thing away, and you go hungry, and nobody knows, and nobody cares, and that's just the shape of it." Cole hadn't moved. "I wasn't being noble," she said. "I want you to understand that. People have been telling that story for 20 years, the cook who gave away her supper, like it was some grand gesture. It wasn't. It was just what I did because I didn't know how to let a hungry child stand in a hallway while I had something she needed. That's not virtue. That's just me. That's who I am. I can't not do it." "I know," he said quietly. "But I was hungry," she said. "I was genuinely, actually hungry, and I was tired, and I had nothing else. And then you came into the kitchen and said something that no one had said to me in, I can't tell you how long. You looked at me directly and said something real, and then you left, and I stood there in that empty kitchen feeling a kind of hunger that had nothing to do with the food, and I couldn't name it then, but I can name it now." She looked at him. It was the hunger of someone who had been invisible for so long that being looked at actually hurt. Like light after dark. It hurt, and it was also the thing I needed most. Cole was quiet for a moment. His jaw moved once, the way it did when he was holding something. "Why didn't you tell me?" he said. "Before now." "Because I didn't want you to feel that you'd rescued me," she said. "Because I wasn't a rescue. I was a woman who made her own choices and found her own way, and I needed you to know that I stayed because I wanted to stay, not because I had nowhere else to go." "I know that," he said. "I've always known that." "I know you have," she said. "But I needed to say it out loud. I needed to say the whole thing out loud to you, at least once." She looked at the lamp. "I went hungry that night, and I would do it again. I would give that bread away 100 times over, because that specific act of not thinking, just doing the only decent thing in front of me, led here. Led to this kitchen, and this table, and this life." A pause. "But I was hungry. I want that part to be real too, not a story where it was easy." Cole reached across the table and put his hand over hers. He didn't say anything for a moment. She let him hold her hand and looked at the lamp and felt the accumulated weight of 20 years, the good and the hard and the ordinary and the unrepeatable, settle around her like something she could finally stop carrying at arm's length and simply put down. "You know what I think about," he said finally, "when I think about that night?" "What?" "I think about what would have happened if I'd left my gloves at the table," he said. "If I'd just gone out the front and not come back for them. If I'd never seen you in the hallway." He turned her hand over slowly. "I think about all the ways it almost didn't happen. And it terrifies me. Not now. Now it's done, and it happened, and we're here. But sometimes I think about the version of this life where I go out the front door that night, and I never know, and it—" He stopped. "I don't like that version." "Neither do I," she said. "The cornbread," he said. "For what it's worth, it was extraordinary, even from across the room." She almost laughed. "You never even tasted it." "I know, that's what I mean." He looked at her. "Whatever you put into that bread, it reached across a crowded room and it made me stop. Made me actually stop and pay attention. And I was a man who didn't stop for much back then." A pause. "You did that, before I even knew your name." She looked at him for a long time. "Cole?" she said. "Yeah." "Go get the children." He blinked. "What?" Go get the children, she said again. Clara and Thomas and Ruth. Will's in town, but the others are here. Go get them and bring them down. He looked at her with the expression he reserved for moments when she did something he hadn't anticipated, which after 20 years still happened more than he'd have predicted. Then he pushed back from the table and went upstairs. She put the kettle on. She brought out the tin of cookies Ruth had baked that afternoon, which were uneven in size and slightly overbrowned on the bottom, and exactly right. She set them on the table. She stood in the kitchen of her house on the land that had become hers, not through inheritance, not through luck, but through the particular combination of her own labor and one night of ordinary kindness, and a man who stopped long enough to see her. And she thought about the girl she'd been in the Millhaven orphanage, quiet and competent and invisible, learning to cook because someone needed her hands and she had them to give. That girl had not known, could not have known. You never know, when you're doing the small decent thing, what it's setting in motion. You give the bread away because the child is hungry and you have it, and there's no real question about what to do. You don't do it for what comes after. You do it because it's the only thing that makes sense in the moment, because you've decided at some level below decision that other people's hunger is something you're going to respond to when you see it. And then 20 years pass and you're standing in a kitchen that is yours, with children coming down the stairs, and the thread you can trace back to that one hungry night is so long and so specific that it almost doesn't seem real. Except it is. It is exactly real. Clara came in first, still holding the book she'd been reading, which she set face down on the work table with the automatic reflex of someone who's grown up knowing you don't put books on the kitchen table. Thomas was behind her, wearing the expression of a 16-year-old who has been summoned without explanation and is reserving judgment. Ruth came last, already suspicious of something ceremonial, her dark eyes moving between her parents with the assessment of a youngest child who has learned to read family atmospheres the way sailors read weather. "What's happening?" Claire said. "Sit down," Eliza said. They sat. Cole sat at the end of the table where he always sat. Eliza sat across from him where she always sat. The lamp was between them. The cookies were on the table. 20 years ago tonight, Eliza said, I gave away my supper. Ruth reached for a cookie and then stopped, sensing correctly that this was the beginning of something she should hear before eating. I was working at a boarding house in town, Eliza said. I was 23 years old and I had been cooking for other people since I was 11, and I had nothing to my name that I could point to and call mine. I had a room and a job, and that was the full extent of it. She looked at her children, one and then the next. I made cornbread that night for myself because there wasn't anything else left. And then a girl came to the door and she was hungry, and I gave it to her. Thomas was frowning slightly, not in disagreement, in concentration, the way he listened when something was being said that he wanted to understand completely. And because of that, Eliza said, your father came into the kitchen, and because he came into the kitchen, he came back. And because he came back, eventually I ended up here. She paused. You exist because I gave a hungry child a piece of cornbread. That's not a small thing. I want you to know it's not a small thing. Clara said quietly, you were hungry too. Yes, Eliza said, I was. But you gave it away anyway. I didn't think about it that hard, Eliza said. That's what I want you to understand. It wasn't heroic, it was just the only thing that made sense to do. The girl was there. The bread was there. She needed it more. She looked at her oldest daughter, who was going to spend her life arguing for people who needed someone to argue for them, and she wanted to give her this, specifically this, before she went out into that life. Most of the time, the right thing isn't complicated. You just have to be willing to be a little hungry for it. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the November wind worked at the eaves in the familiar way, the sound the house made in cold weather that had become, over 20 years, the sound of home. Ruth picked up her cookie. She looked at it for a moment with the gravity of a 9-year-old doing something deliberate. Then she set it back down and looked at her mother. Can I have the recipe? She said. For the cornbread. Eliza looked at her. I want to learn to make it, Ruth said. The real one. Something moved through Eliza that she didn't try to name. She nodded. Tomorrow morning, she said. Early. Before anyone else is up. Ruth nodded, satisfied, and picked up her cookie again. Cole looked at Eliza from the end of the table. His eyes said what they'd been saying for 20 years, which was the same thing in the same way, clear and unambiguous. I see you. I've always seen you. She looked back. The cookies were eaten, the tea was drunk, the children drifted back to their rooms in the comfortable, unhurried way of people in a house where there is no particular urgency at the end of the day, just the ordinary movement of a family settling in for the night. Cole banked the fire. Eliza washed the cups. The house around them held its warmth against the November dark the way it always did. Later she would think about what it meant, the long, strange line of it, from an orphanage in Millhaven County to this kitchen, from invisibility to this specific life. She would think about the girl with the rope belt who was somewhere out in the world now, grown, living whatever life the years had made for her, who would never know what she had set in motion by standing in a hallway and coughing at the right moment. She would think about the particular mercy of small things, of how the important moments never announce themselves, how the hinge point of an entire life can look, from the outside, like just a woman giving bread to a hungry child on an ordinary Tuesday night. She was not going to wrap it in a lesson. She was too honest for that, and too tired of stories that arrived at their endings too cleanly, with all the rough edges sanded off. Life had edges. That was what made it real. The cornbread was good, and she had been hungry, and the child had needed it, and she'd given it anyway, and that was a true and complete account of what had happened. What came after was not a reward. It was not the universe settling a debt. It was just what happened next, one thing following another in the long chain of consequence that connects a person to every decision they ever make, consciously or not. What she believed, what 20 years had made her believe, not because she'd been taught it, but because she'd lived it, was simpler than a lesson. It was more like a fact. The way you move through the world when nobody is watching. That is who you are. Not the version you perform for the people who matter, not the self you construct for approval or assessment. The version that acts when there's a hungry child in a hallway and you have the only bread. That version. That is the one that determines what your life becomes. Eliza Mercer had been that version, quietly and consistently, since she was 11 years old, standing in an orphanage kitchen learning to cook because someone needed her hands. The rest had followed. She turned off the lamp in the kitchen and went upstairs to where her husband was already half asleep. And the house held its warmth around all of them through the November night. And in the morning, Ruth would be at the kitchen door before 6, waiting to learn to make cornbread from scratch. And Eliza would teach her. Not the whole story. Ruth would come to that in her own time, when she was old enough to understand what it costs to give something away, and why you do it anyway. But she would teach her the cornbread, the real one, the one that had started everything. She would teach her the exact weight of the flour, and how the buttermilk should feel when you add it, and where the heat runs lower in the oven and why you put it there on purpose. She would teach her the way her own hands had learned it, through touch and adjustment and the particular knowledge that comes from caring enough to pay attention. And someday Ruth would stand in her own kitchen, in her own life, and make it for someone who needed it, and she would not remember all the mornings she spent learning it at her mother's elbow, but her hands would remember, and that would be enough. That had always been enough. The woman nobody noticed became the heart of something that outlasted her invisibility by decades. And the man who stopped long enough to look, he had simply done what any of us can do, on any ordinary evening, in any crowded room. He had paid attention. That was all. That was everything.